Now, in October of the last year, in 2001, a great fear spread throughout America, and maybe throughout the world. A great fear about something that might invade our lives and kill us. We knew about this man who died down there in Delray Beach, Boca Raton, and we heard a word, and that word was anthrax. And then all of a sudden we got all these articles distinguishing the different kinds of anthrax. There was inhalation, anthrax the worst. You breathed the spores into your lungs, and that's generally phene. We learned about gastrointestinal anthrax. The spores are digested. They enter into your stomach, and there's very, very severe internal bleeding, maybe followed by blood poisoning. And then we read about cutaneous anthrax. That's the anthrax that comes through your skin through touch. It's the least severe form. There are headaches and aching muscles and vomiting and diarrhea and all of that. We heard about anthrax, but the anthrax that stuck in our mind was inhalation anthrax, dying. And then all of a sudden we became concerned. I mean, after all, the incident occurred at a post office in Boca Raton. And then all of a sudden, anthrax showed up in Washington, D.C. Senator Tom Daschle, you know, his office, I mean, there was anthrax in that office, and there was a post office connected with that. And then it shows up in New York. Tom Brokaw even is sent anthrax. There's NBC and CBS and another post office somewhere in Princeton. And then all of a sudden it happens. People are afraid to open their mail. It didn't happen to anybody in this room. I can see. But people were afraid to open their mail. I mean, was there that little white powder dusting? And all of a sudden, the police department has to hire extra people or take the cops that normally would work on public safety, and they have to run from house to house and building to building because somebody has gotten what? A suspicious piece of mail. There is no return address. The police are now wearing white gloves. And often people who are opening their mail are now wearing white gloves. Well, the scare was pretty powerful for about 2 months. From time to time, other incidents show up. Was it anthrax? Is it anthrax? All of a sudden in the newspapers, there are all these long articles about anthrax, spores coming out of the soil, rubbing the noses of livestock, entering livestock. Maybe we digest the livestock, or we deal with the dead bodies of the livestock, and we get the anthrax. Anthrax has been around for a long, long time. But to cultivate it and to ship it as a vehicle of death to your enemy. Well, the anthrax scare became part of what we call our vision of the new world in which we live. The new world in which we live has something that we're not quite sure we know how to handle. We'd like the Army to handle it. That would be very, very nice. It's called terrorism. And terrorism is not conducted by conventional armies. Terrorism is conducted by clandestine armies, and those armies, quite frankly, do not have to be larger than 3 or 4 people. 3 or 4 people determined to create havoc using the technology of today can produce extraordinary results. Terrorism is generally directed by clandestine armies to establishments, namely established governments. Their purpose ultimately is to overthrow them, to punish them. And the most frequent targets of terrorism are not the military, because attacking the military could be what? Very dangerous. You might need a strong military of your own to attack the military. The targets of terrorism are generally civilian targets. And the purpose of terrorism, including biological terrorism, is to demoralize people. When people are spending their lives putting white gloves on to open the mail, they are already demoralized. They are already demoralized. The idea is to create an environment of such fear that people are unable to function. They're afraid to go out of their house. They're afraid to go to central places. They're afraid to get on an airplane. They're afraid to pass go. Now, the targets of terrorists are leaders. Is there a president? Is there a general? Is there a major figure? Kill them. And in fact, the oldest form of terrorism is assassination. And that's been going on for a long time. We've had quite a few presidents who were assassinated. There have been many, many leaders of countries for centuries who have been killed by terrorists. One of the targets is the infrastructure. Blow up a bridge. What if they blew up the Ambassador Bridge? Huh? Blow up a tunnel. Blow up a road. Blow up a power line. What you want to do is to create enormous public disruption. One of the targets sometimes is the military. I mean, sometimes terrorists will pick on the small military. They will attack a military base if there aren't too many people around to offer resistance. Blowing up something on a military base, after all, is viewed as quite a victory. One of the things that is the target are symbols of power. The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center were symbols of power. To make them crumble was very important. One of the targets are central places. Central places, well, they're like the places in Jerusalem, like Ben Yehuda Street. It's like where people go and what? And shop. What you want to do is you want to prevent people from conducting their normal life. They're so afraid that they can't even go out to the central places where most people congregate and meet. And certainly one of the major targets are just the general population. And each one of us is needy and fragile and vulnerable. So let's talk about our vulnerability. Well, there's our physical safety. There could be, certainly if you're walking in Belfast, you might bump into a what? A bomb that will go off. The same thing could happen in Jerusalem. The same thing might happen in Basque territory in Spain. There is the assault, our vulnerability on our property. Somebody burns down our house. Somebody destroys our automobile, our car. There's our food. Oh. What if you walk into a restaurant and do not know that the food you're eating is safe? What if somebody just gets into that kitchen and just teaspoon here, a teaspoon there, less than that, and what? There you are. What about our water? One of the great scenarios that's always imagined is that what? Something poisonous is put into our water system. And then there's the air. What if all of a sudden you're breathing the air and it's Tokyo and it's sarin gas? Oh. And then something very important to us is our health and our life. Now, the weapons that have been used by terrorists generally have been weapons that were used by the military. I mean, there are old weapons. The old weapons that were used by terrorists are hand weapons. So most assassinations, certainly until the 16th, 17th, or 18th century, were done by what? By hand. Somebody had a dagger, a spear, a sword. But that was limited. And then in the 19th century, there appeared what we call the explosive thing, really earlier, with the coming of gunpowder. And after all, the Chinese only knew how to make firecrackers out of it. But the Western powers discovered they could use gunpowder for an explosive purpose, which enabled missiles to what? The bullets to be what? Sent. Well, that explosive power was certainly increased in the 19th and early 20th century with the development of dynamite and bombs. So that's the old stuff, and in fact, we sort of got used to it. I mean, the First World War began with what? An act of terrorism, a bomb thrown at a carriage, and the Archduke of Austria and his wife are killed. But now we're into what we call the new weapons. The new weapons are certainly used by the conventional military of established governments, but they're now used by the clandestine armies. The first is what I call air transportation. We experienced that with great power in World War II. I mean, you come and you what? You just drop it from the air. It could be a bomb, an explosive. And then, in 1945, we were made aware of another extraordinary power. It's a kind of explosive, but it's so explosive, so extraordinarily explosive, it's like in a different category. We call it nuclear. Now, we've always thought of nuclear bombs being in the hands of governments, right? But certainly in 2002, it's quite possible if you contact internet and pick up the information, you might be able to assemble your own little nuclear device, and if that were the case, it would be something quite readily available to clandestine armies. And then there's something that's been tried before. Many of the victims of the First World War were victims of chemicals, of gas. Already by the beginning of the 20th century, there was a form of warfare, new warfare, called chemical warfare. And it was used not simply by clandestine armies, it was also used by governments. But one of the most frightening tools in the armory of either established governments or clandestine armies is something that we call biological warfare. Biological warfare is the ability to use our enemies in the organic world, who assault us on a continuous basis, to use them against us and against our health. Now, the purpose of biological warfare is to produce in the general population debilitating and sometimes even fatal diseases. That's it. To deliberately insert them into the population. And of course, in the armory of this are conventional things. I mean, think of all the things that have frightened us through the ages. One of the most frightening things that killed over 1/3 of the people of Europe in 1348 was the bubonic plague. The plague kept coming back and back and back and back. What if you could bottle it and bring it to the center of Bloomfield Hills? Oh. Smallpox, which we thought we had conquered. What if you could take the most virulent forms of smallpox, which often killed people, bottle it, and insert it right into the middle? Typhoid, typhus, I mean, just go down the list. Just the conventional things. Now, the use of biological warfare has been going on for a long while, so let me just read this little thing from a wonderful book which is called Germs. Just the name. One word, Germs. It's written by a team of 4 reporters from the New York Times. The 2 main ones, a woman called Judith Miller, whose columns I read on a regular basis, and another is a man called William Broad. And in this book, they talk about the old forms. Germs and warfare are old allies. More than 2 millennia ago, Scythian archers dipped arrowheads in manure and rotting corpses to increase the deadliness of their weapons. Tatars in the 14th century hurled dead bodies foul with plague over the walls of enemy cities. That's biological warfare. British soldiers during the French and Indian War gave unfriendly tribes blankets sewn, S-O-W-N, with smallpox. The Germans in World War I spread glanders, a disease of horses, among the mounts of rival cavalries. And all the way up to the Second World War, using the same old technique, the Japanese in World War II dropped fleas infected with plague on Chinese cities, killing hundreds and perhaps thousands of people. So this is what? I mean, this has been going on. It's not something new. However, the foundation of what I call the new biological warfare is something that we call science. I mean, modern science has transformed the character of biological warfare. You may have known in the 14th century that if you had a dead body and the person had died of plague, that most likely there was something about it that might, what? Infect somebody, so you threw it over the wall. But now you have biology, and modern biology means that we discovered, certainly in the 19th century, the enemy. We have now looked at the enemy through a microscope. They're microbes. Oh. They're these little what? By the way, we all have them, millions and millions and maybe billions of them crawling all over our body right now. Many of them are very useful, by the way. If we didn't have them, we wouldn't survive. They're called bacteria. They're the microbes, and they're all in there. Don't get concerned. They're there. They're doing their job. They're unavoidable. We think we wash and we wash and we wash and we wash and we wash them all off. Wrong. They're there, and in many cases we need them. So now we've seen them, the little things. And even smaller and less complex than the bacteria are these little things that function almost like genes, like workers in the cell. Sometimes they're friendly and sometimes they're unfriendly. It's now a new word. It's sort of an unfriendly word for most people, although they can be friendly. They're called virus. The bacteria and the viruses, we have now confronted them. They are the enemy. We didn't understand who our enemy was really before the 19th and 20th century, but now modern science has shown them to us. And now that you know them, sometimes we are their victims. But the question is, can you turn them into our slaves? If you can turn them into our slaves, you can then use them for whatever good or foul purpose you want. And all of that, of course, has been compounded by the emergence of a science in the 20th century that we call genetics. We now understand that we're composed of all these cells. At the center of the cells are these nuclei, that in each nucleus is this panoply of genes. And in fact, they program our behavior. What if you have what I would call a juvenile delinquent bacterium? I mean, it's not behaving well from our agenda, but it's not terribly harmful. We may just vomit from it, or we may just have a stomach ache or cramps or something like that. What if you could alter its programming just a little bit? And turn it into a major criminal. Do you understand what genetics now allows? Now we're into the world of genetic manipulation. You can take things that are harmful, and maybe with just a little bit of adjustment, you can turn them into major criminals against human beings. I mean, there are lots of things, by the way, that modern biology provides. Let me just tell you about freezing, which is very important. In the battle between man and microorganisms, refrigeration slows down germ reproduction and metabolism. Typically, cooling also lengthens the lives of microbes. When microbes are frozen in exactly the right way, that is surrounded by sugar and protein, cooled quickly, in case you're cooking a microbe, cooled or freezing one, cooled quickly and put under high vacuum to remove ice in a process known as sublimation, they can enter a dormant state in which they behave like vegetative spores. This process is known as lyophilization or freeze drying. Once dormant, the germ remains asleep even when returned to room temperature, staying that way for years. This is storage now, or even decades. Industry uses the trick to make dry yeast for baking. It is only when such hibernating organisms are doused with water that they revive and multiply, in effect, rising from the dead. Now you can store them. Oh. In addition, you can do all this wonderful, wonderful manipulation. It began over a midnight snack. In late 1972, Stanley N. Cohn, a young colleague of the professor from the University of Wisconsin-Lederbergs at the Stanford School of Medicine, and Herbert W. Boyer, a biochemist at the University of California, San Francisco, were attending a conference in Hawaii. As the scientists talked in a deli late one night, they realized that by teaming up, they might do something that had never been done before. Move DNA, those DNA molecules, the genes, from one organism into another, creating a new form of life. They wanted to merge the genes of organisms that were wholly unrelated, for example, those of dissimilar germs or maybe even plants and animals. Scientists had already taken a first step discovering how enzymes could cut loose individual genes from a strand of DNA. Moving a gene from one organism to another was a greater challenge. Cohn and Boyer saw promise in the early experiments that showed how bugs accomplish such transfers in nature. Genes were found to move on tiny rings of DNA that pass freely between bacteria. Liederberg named them plasmids. Researchers had also recently figured out how to glue together snippets of DNA, suggesting an intriguing possibility. Perhaps genes snipped from one organism could hitch a ride on a plasmid as it moved into another. In theory, Cohn and Boyer realized genetic engineering might be simple. The two scientists could slice the DNA from one organism, paste it into a plasmid, and move it into an unrelated form of life. Well, that was the beginning of the process that we now call that genetic manipulation, moving what? Genes from one to the other. So if you have an organism that's mildly bad, you can what? Turn it into something terribly bad. You can conceive, if you will, of the worst possible plague. And then you don't have to say, well, what organism presently exists to produce that plague? You can now say, well, this organism has that's what I need, and this one has what? That's what I need, and this one has what? That's what I need, and I can now what? Paste them together. Now, the stimulus for what we call biological warfare stemmed from the events of the 20th century. Certainly, it was already being discussed in the First World War. Now, in order to develop this kind of warfare, you have to enter into a world where there are no holds barred. You can't have what we call the kind of enemy you had in the Middle Ages, because then warfare was governed by what we call the rules of chivalry. You can only have it in a world in which your enemy is demonized. The enemy is so terrible that no matter what you do, he deserves it. Got it? If you're simply having an argument and a fight, you can't use this kind of warfare. You can only use it if your enemy is demonized. And quite frankly, in order to fight world wars, what you have to do is to demonize your enemy. You have to turn your enemy into the devil. Otherwise, you cannot mobilize the people to go out and risk their lives to fight the war. And already in the First World War, because of modern technology and the development of propaganda, the demonization of the enemy now appeared. The demonization of the enemy turned the Germans in the First World War into the Huns, right? Les Boches, the worst. They were the devil. And if you killed them in any way, if you chopped them up into little pieces, it was what? All right. And then that was, of course, aggravated by the events of October 1917, when the communist rebellion took place, revolution. And now there was a war between the forces of righteousness and the forces of communism, or on the other side, the forces of the revolution and what? The evil capitalist enemy. Well, if you have that kind of an enemy, if they're the devil, if they're no good, if they're rotten, you can what? Use any weapon. Give them the plague. Make them vomit, make them die in horror. So you need the demonization of the enemy, and what followed the advent of what we call anti-communism. Adolf Hitler shows up, and fascism. And most likely the turning of him into a devil was justified, but the point was, there you had the enemy. And the Japanese. Certainly the use of the atomic bomb by us in World War II was a function of the way we viewed our enemy. They were indeed devilish and demonic. Their cause was devilish and demonic. You could use anything you wanted. The use of gassing in the First World War is an example of what we call the demonization process. And then after the Second World War and the victory over fascism came the Cold War and the revival of the conflict with communism, and in that war too, no holds barred. The enemy is the devil, the incarnation of evil. And we have that right now. In the minds of Al-Qaeda, or whatever people, sent the anthrax, in their minds, they are noble and righteous people, defending the will of God. I mean, they're not the mafia, do you understand, throwing bodies over the bridge. They see themselves as righteous people. And in fact, Western culture, the United States of America, Israel, whatever it is, they are the devil. And if you're fighting the devil, you can use anything. Of course you can. What do you mean chivalry? Does the devil honor chivalry? Never. So our problem, by the way, today is that in order to fight wars, we have to demonize our enemies. Otherwise, we can't mobilize the people to do it. And in the process of demonizing the enemy, we justify almost any means of winning the war. It's no longer 2 nights in a tournament, stopping to help a lady cross a puddle. I mean, nothing. It's to the death, by any means. So out of it comes any possibility. And now that demonization is assisted by modern technology. If you put that demonization attitude and modern technology together, you get one of the most horrible realities. Even Saddam Hussein has convinced the Iraqi people that what? They are surrounded by the devil that wants to destroy them. This devil has no value, no moral worth whatsoever. If we were to drop little spores on them, that would be exactly what they deserve. Sometimes I wonder, in terms of modern times, what was worse? The use of science to develop the most lethal weapons in the world, or the habit of demonization, which what? Justifies and moves along the process. Now, the United States of America was one of the first nations responding to the devil, to communism and to fascism, to develop biological weapons. It all began in the age of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. One of the advantages, by the way, of biological weapons over nuclear weapons is they're much cheaper. A little lab, a few scientists, and what? You can put together a package. You want to put together the atomic bomb or the hydrogen bomb, it will cost you billions and billions and billions of dollars. There's a low cost factor to biological weapons. Now already we see the emergence of this. I don't know whether you ever heard of Fort Detrick, Maryland. I hadn't until recently. So let me read you about it. With intelligence agencies warning that Tokyo and Berlin had biological weapons, Washington began to mobilize against germ attacks in 1942. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt publicly denounced the exotic arms of America's foes as terrible and inhumane. even while preparing to retaliate in kind. The man chosen to lead the secret U.S. program was George W. Merck, the president of a drug company. Merck was a household name, and generations of physicians had come to rely on the Merck Manual as a trusted guide for diagnosing and treating disease. But the new effort was designated or designed to be nearly invisible. Its degree of secrecy matched only by America's project to build the atom bomb simultaneously. The Germ initiative had its headquarters at Camp Detrick, an old Army base in rural Maryland that was close enough to Washington for quick responsiveness, but far enough away to ensure a margin of isolating safety. The work got underway in 1943 and expanded quickly. From a rural outpost in farm country, the base grew overnight into a dense metropolis of 250 buildings and living quarters for 5,000 people. The post was ringed by fences, towers, and floodlights. Guards, under orders to shoot first and ask questions later, kept their machine guns loaded. The scientists were issued pistols, which they kept at their sides or nearby on workbenches. The headquarters building at the heart of the compound had its own set of armed guards on alert around the clock. All personnel had identity passes with employee photos, a security precaution that would become widespread in future decades. Persons leaving the post surrendered their photo passes to the guards. Accidentally keeping one could lead to arrest and interrogation. The scientists toiled on anthrax. Yes, this is an American, Camp Detrick, for killing enemy troops, and agricultural blights for destroying Japanese rice and German potatoes. It wasn't easy work. For instance, they had to coax the anthrax bug into its best form. Toward the end of its growth cycle, they used heat or chemical shock to force the rod-shaped bacteria to convert into spores, a dormant state. And when the process worked properly, the spores were very hardy, resisting heat, disinfectants, sunlight, and other environmental factors. The Detrick scientists also learned how to reap the poisons that some bacteria excrete, a tactic that sidestepped the necessity of infection and instead yielded deadly toxins that could be sprayed directly on foes. One was the botulinum or botulinum, whatever, toxin, the most poisonous compound known to science. The Americans were experimenting with this. It paralyzes muscles, including the diaphragm, without which the lungs cannot function, and its victims quickly die. In time, the scientists learned how to make botulinum or botulinum toxin so concentrated that a pound of it, if properly dispersed, could, in theory, kill 1 billion people. Now, this was going on while the atomic bomb research was going on. It was much less expensive, by the way. 250 buildings, some rural place in Camp, Maryland. It was in response, obviously, to how we view the enemy. Was indeed the enemy, were the Germans and the Japanese experimenting with biological warfare? The answer was yes, so we now had to what? Charge up our own places, and so we produced anthrax and botulinum and the whole thing. So America was one of the major what? Manufacturers of biological warfare. In fact, there were many interesting kinds of experiments that were done at Camp Detrick. American scientists also did outdoor experiments to assess how Soviet cities could be attacked with anthrax germs. This was after the end of the Second World War. The Cold War had begun. Dry runs were made against St. Louis, Minneapolis, and Winnipeg, cities whose climates and sizes were judged similar to the Soviet targets. The effort was codenamed Project St. Joe. The clandestine tests included 173 releases of non-infectious aerosols, were meant to determine how much agent would have to rain down on Kiev, Leningrad, and Moscow to kill its residents. Each cluster bomb in the planned attacks held 536 bomblets. Upon hitting the ground, each bomblet would emit a little more than an ounce of anthrax mist. The disease, if untreated, kills nearly every infected person. a very high rate of mortality, even compared with plague and most other pathogens. So, by the way, this has been going on a continuing, do you understand? Camp Detrick has been around on a continuing basis. However, the Vietnam War changed things. In the Vietnam War, there was public resistance to even participating in the war. And ultimately, Lyndon Baines Johnson fell from power. He was replaced by Richard Nixon, who came to power in 1969. And wanting in some way to win favor with the opposition, in 1969, Richard Nixon declared a ban on the development and manufacture of biological weapons, hoping to persuade the communists ultimately to do the same. Now, that ban was ultimately part of what we call the treaty. Remember that anti-ballistic missile treaty of 1972 between the Russians and the Americans? It was put into the treaty, which was the ban on the manufacture of biological weapons. And then in 1975 came another reinforcement of the treaty with the Convention of 1975. But the experimentation didn't stop. In fact, a second facility was built in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Well, why do they continue it? Well, very simple. We are not sure that our enemies are going to stop production of biological weapons. So at least we need to what? Develop vaccines to resist them. So if the Russians are still making them and they want to use them, we have the what? We have the vaccine. But in order to produce the vaccine, you have to continue the research. You still have to work with the what? With the anthrax in order to get the anthrax vaccine. So in Pine Bluff, under the justification of creating the vaccine, the research continued. By the way, the biological warfare was developed by the Russians. I mean, overwhelmingly to a far greater extent than by the Americans. Many of their sites were to be found in Siberia and in Kazakhstan. In fact, when I was in Kazakhstan about 3 years ago, my train stopped only a few yards from one of the former major centers of the development of biological weapons. There was an incident that occurred in 1979 during the Brezhnev regime, which was covered up. Quite a few people died of some dreadful disease in Sverdlovsk. Sverdlovsk is in western Siberia. It's a major city in western Siberia, a dirty industrial city. In fact, Yeltsin was the communist leader of Sverdlovsk. And sort of known by the Americans was that one of the major factories for the production, or centers, research centers, for the development of biological weapons was in Sverdlovsk. And an accident occurred, and anthrax escaped from the plant and invaded the city. The Russians denied publicly that anything terrible had happened, but it was very clear that dozens of people had been affected, and many, many died. It was a terrible disaster. During the cooling off period, when Gorbachev came to power, what happened was that various Russian defectors made their way to America and revealed what was going on in the Soviet Union in terms of biological warfare. So let me just read you about one defector. A few months later, in October 1989, that's 4 years after Gorbachev came to power, a top Soviet biologist defected into Britain and told a very different story. Vladimir Pasechnik described to interrogators a top-secret world in which tens of thousands of specialists were laboring to perfect and deploy germ weapons. Yes, Pasechnik said, the Soviet Union had produced long-range missiles to deliver germs. He had been the director of the Institute for Ultra-Pure Biological Preparations in Leningrad, one of scores of false fronts scattered throughout the Soviet Union. His institute of 400 scientists, he said, had been doing research on modifying cruise missiles to spread germs. The low-flying robotic craft, which can outwit early warning systems, were adapted to spray clouds of aerosolized pathogens over unsuspecting foes. Never before had Western experts penetrated so deeply into the Soviet germ program, and what they found seemed to go beyond the most hawkish views of the bugs and gas experts. American intelligence analysts had guessed that the Soviets might be working on the bubonic plague, but Patrick and other experts had dismissed the idea, noting that the United States had never been able to produce an aerosolized mist plague microbe that could survive outside the laboratory. Pasechnik told his British handlers that his institute had succeeded where the Americans failed. It had even created a new genetically improved version of the Black Death. The superbug that he and his colleagues had created was more resistant to heat, cold, and antibiotics, Pasechnik said. The Soviets had put the discoveries of Cohn and Boyer to lethal use. One of the Americans' early experiments had created a penicillin-resistant strain of a common bacteria. The Soviets had used the same technique to perfect their plague weapon. Plasmids, the tiny rings of DNA crucial for gene engineering, also controlled a germ's natural defenses against microbial foes. The Soviets had tinkered with the plasmids of plague, making the new strain impervious to existing vaccines and antibiotics. It was a disconcerting milestone. Now, the big question, of course, with all of this is, when the Soviet Union fell, what happened to all these supplies? Well, first, really, did the Russians indeed, having repudiated communism, did the Russian military also repudiate the production of biological weapons? And all evidence indicates that they did not. That often the Russian military operated by itself, independent of direction from the central government. And their hostility, after years of the demonization of the West, was to preserve Russian military might by preserving the biological weapons. And in addition, many plants and facilities were closed. And in fact, the supplies destroyed or dispersed. Did they find their way to places like Iran or Iraq or North Korea? The foundation of biological weapons lies in the two massive programs of the United States of America and the Soviet Union. None of the other programs that has emerged can possibly equal those two programs. And a lot of the biological weapons circulating around the world, in fact, are derivative from those programs, providing supplies for those people who may indeed want to constitute terrorist clandestine armies. Now, one of the things that's happened is we have a new enemy who, to a large degree, has been demonized, and maybe justifiably. This is an enemy that has also demonized us. Russia and the communist world are no longer the what? The enemy. The enemy now lies in the Muslim world. And in the Muslim world, there are countries which are, for a variety of reasons, overwhelmingly hostile to the United States of America. One of the most hostile is Iraq, although it has a strange history. Iraq became, after 1958, with the change of government after a military coup, violently anti-American, an ally of Russia, and all of that reinforced by the Arab hostility to the state of Israel. But then, in 1979, when Ayatollah Khomeini took over in Iran, Iraq went to war with Iran. Iran was our enemy, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So now, encouraged by the Saudis in Saudi Arabia, the American government sort of made up with Iraq. In fact, throughout the 1980s, we sent money to Iraq, some of which was used to produce biological weapons. In fact, some of those biological weapons may have initially come out of the alliance of Iraq with the Soviet Union. In the 1980s, as the power of the Soviet Union declines, Iraq turns more and more to the United States of America. In fact, Saddam Hussein is puzzled when he invades Kuwait and he finds that the United States of America turns against him. Was he not an ally of the United States? Meanwhile, he's developed biological weapons. If you ask him, does he have any biological weapons, his answer is always what? No. But he now has biological weapons, and in 1990, the end of 1990, after the occupation of Kuwait, the United States of America issues an ultimatum to Iraq to pull out of Kuwait. If Iraq does not pull out of Kuwait, then war. Now, in the military, although Schwarzkopf looked calm, there was a lot of nervousness. The nervousness was the following. We're going to send thousands and thousands and thousands of American troops over to Saudi Arabia to invade Iraq. They certainly have good military training, and they have the finest equipment. But Iraq, we know, has biological weapons. They certainly have anthrax, they certainly have the botulinum. They've got all of it. What if they use it against our troops? What if they kill hundreds and thousands of American troops? We were not privy to that discussion because there was rah-rah in the newspapers. There was some discussion on television and in the New York Times about the issue, but it became a very big issue. How do we protect our troops? By that time, the U.S. government sort of woke up to the fact that it needed to defend its own army against biological war. It needed vaccines and antibiotics, and they hadn't really thought through it. There was the beginning of it. Some kind of contract had been signed with some kind of a firm in Michigan. But they had not produced sufficient supplies of reliable vaccine, anthrax vaccine. So now they have an insufficient supply of anthrax vaccine to inoculate the troops with. So, do you inoculate none, or do you inoculate some? If you inoculate some, who? You call up the mothers, to find out whose son should get an inoculation. It was a very terrifying moment. They wanted Schwarzkopf to make the decision. And he always appeared decisive, 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 decisive. Schwarzkopf says, not me. Let Bush, that's the other Bush. Let Bush, I want President Bush to make this decision. Who gets the vaccine? But what it did trigger, of course, was this desire now to respond to the threat. How do we protect the American army and the American people against this biological warfare, which we ourselves have engaged in or plan to engage in, but now at least are publicly committed to what? To end. What do we do? I do want to tell you that they were inoculated, not everybody. Now, the Gulf War produced a crisis because after the Gulf War, there were many, many veterans who became debilitated. Many people said, the government initially said, well, it's a nervous reaction, stress, whatever else it was. But they persisted. There were many who persisted and many who sued the government. The claim was that although the United States of America and the world press had maintained that Iraq had not used biological weapons, that indeed they had. And that the disabilities and ruined lives of many of these veterans, American and other than American, was due to biological weaponry mists that had been dropped on American troops and other troops. Now that argument is what? Still going on. It's an ongoing argument because if indeed that was true, the cost to the government would be absolutely overwhelming, but that of course raises a moral issue. If you send somebody into battle to fight for his country and maybe to die for his or her country, do you not have the moral obligation to what? To take care of them if they encounter the most deadly of weapons and their lives are ruined? So the Gulf War triggered this great fear in the United States of America, which was later aggravated. A mistake was made. By the way, hindsight's very good. But a mistake was made. The mistake that was made, certainly by the Bush administration, was not to pursue Saddam Hussein. The idea was that he was finished, that his army had been destroyed, and that now he could not stay in power. It would be better in terms of winning the support of the Iraqi people if Iraqis overthrew Saddam. And it was that he did not fall. It was all a miscalculation. The Republican Guard, the heart of his army, was not destroyed. In fact, they remained intact, and within 3 weeks after the defeat, they had established a regime of repression in southern and middle Iraq, which still exists. And he remains in power, and now he is the implacable enemy of the United States of America. We are the devil. Now, his biological weaponry sites, as judged by the Americans, were bombed. Did the Americans have accurate information? By the way, there's danger in bombing biological weaponry sites. So you drop the bomb, and out come the spores, out come the bugs. But the rumor had it that his biological weaponry resources had hardly been damaged, that they were there. So now he remains in power, and now the United States influences the United Nations, and the United Nations applies sanctions, and the sanctions say that until you compensate the Kuwaitis and until you destroy all your chemical and biological weapons, you're not going to be free of the sanctions. And the way we're going to judge it is to send inspectors into the place. So, for 8 years, we read about it in the paper, inspectors arrived, and all the time they were frustrated. They were greeted at the airport with the band. Hello, 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 hello. They were taken to very, very nice hotels. They were taken to buildings which the government claimed had formerly been places for the manufacture of biological weapons, not to kill people, mainly to affect crops. Thank you. And they found nothing, although they found in many of these buildings that the amenities, like the ventilation systems, didn't seem to apply to the activities that were being described as being the activities of the building. And they were sure there were other sites not being shown to them that were the places for the manufacture of biological weapons. So now this great anxiety ensued. In fact, there was impasse. Ultimately, Saddam Hussein kicked out the inspectors. Ultimately, citing the suffering of the Iraqi people, which indeed had been great under the sanctions, he persuades the United Nations to allow him to sell some of his oil. He now has oil revenue. He now continues his what? His biological weapons program, and he is now the implacable enemy of the United States of America, the global economy, whatever you want. And although he was a secularist himself, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, he loves Osama bin Laden. Oh. Is it possible that Saddam Hussein, Mr. Nice Guy, is it possible that Saddam Hussein would now provide biological weaponry supplies to the enemies of the United States of America and the global economy? I mean, he denies what? That he's making the stuff. But all the evidence seems to prove that indeed he is. So now we come to what happened after the defeat of Saddam Hussein. Defeat, well, it was a defeat, but he survived. In 1993, 2 years after the war, came the bombing at the World Trade Center. Not this bomb, last bomb. The first bombing at the World Trade Center, which terrified people in America, including the American government. And suddenly people became aware that terrorists could penetrate into the very heart of the United States of America. And that was reinforced. In March of 1995, an incident occurred that wasn't biological warfare. It occurred in Tokyo. You may remember there was this Japanese cult led by this charismatic Buddhist figure, Om Shikro. And there was that incident in the Tokyo subway station where people died from inhaling or became overwhelmingly sick from inhaling sarin gas, chemical warfare. All of a sudden, there's this frightening survival of Iraq. The communists are gone. the survival of Iraq with biological weapons, and now the beginning of terrorism in what we call Western environments, and Japan is basically a what? For all practical purposes, a Western environment. And then, 1 month later, in April of 1995, nothing to do with Iraq, although initially people thought it had been engineered by Muslim fundamentalists. The building in Oklahoma City blew up. It was an act of terrorism conducted by Native Americans. I mean by Americans. And that really shook the government. By that time, Bill Clinton was the President of the United States. And he was very, very interested in how do you cope with it. What that did was it reawakened an anxiety about not only explosive weapons used by terrorists, but also by chemical and biological weapons, because now that was a real possibility. And in fact, more money was now voted by Congress, asked by the administration, to support the development of vaccines and antibiotics to deal with the crisis. And in fact, in 1999, for the first time, there was a mass inoculation of American troops against anthrax. The anthrax vaccine was used. Well, America now is sort of waking up, and in fact, all of that is reinforced by the fact that Osama bin Laden is now beginning to emerge. He emerged before September the 11th. He was the man who was responsible for the bombing of the American embassies in Kenya and in Tanzania, and now the question was, he has explosives and he has suicide bombers, if you will. Does he also have chemical and biological weapons? And certainly, with the fall of the Twin Towers on September the 11th, that question is overwhelming, so overwhelming that when the anthrax scare appeared shortly after the fall of the Twin Towers, the question, or it wasn't a question, the answer showed up. That's him. We don't know that it was him. There are lots of crazy people around, lots of people who hate what? The government, the people. It would only take, maybe one Unabomber with some access to anthrax supplies to do this. We don't know. But the anxiety certainly was there. And now, the American public has a concern. But let me talk about concerns, because it's hard for people to remember an incident, because it's so diverting these days, most likely for more than 2 months, so things have quieted down. But it's easy to what? Like reawaken it. In the unconscious somewhere, or in the subconscious, is the sense that there are enemies around. They're clandestine and they're secret. They hate us, hate us, hate us. They will use any weapon against us. They've already used the weapon of an airplane missile and explosion. Why would they not choose to use chemical weapons and biological weapons? So that raises certain questions. Who in the world today has, as far as we know, these biological weapons? 2, where are they stored if we know where they are stored? 3, what's in storage? 4, how would they use it if they wanted to use it? Would there be bomblets and mist? 5, what are the possibilities that are now evolving of what we call new biological weapons? You know, what's on the horizon? 6, how have we in the United States of America so far responded to this? And last, what do we need to do to cope with this fear and with this anxiety and with this reality? Who has the biological weapons? Well, it's very clear that 2 of the nations that most likely have the largest reserves of biological weapons are the United States of America and the former Soviet Union, which is Russia. Actually, what can happen is the facility that you have to produce the vaccine can easily be turned around to what? Producing the weapon, the biological weapon. And so there they are. It is very clear that there are somewhere around 25 nations in the world that have some access to biological weapons. Among the more striking ones, certainly, are Iraq in the Muslim world and Iran, and the Iranian supplies most likely ultimately derive their source from the breakup of the Soviet Union. A lot of these biological weapons passed off into what we call the private market, where indeed they were sold off to other nations. One of the rogue nations, and it really is a rogue nation, it's the one country I've wanted to go to that I haven't been able to get into. So if you have any connection to help me, no, I'd appreciate it. It's called North Korea. I have tried and tried and tried. I don't know why I'm on their blacklist. I cannot figure out why I'm on their blacklist. I can't get into North Korea. There's no doubt about it. North Korea has devoted a large amount of its resources not only to this incredibly oversized military in a country in which over 1/2 the people are starving, but they've also cultivated biological weapons. And so they're distributed in large and small numbers among 25 nations in the world, but also they're in the possession of what we call clandestine organizations. So one of the interesting stories, in fact, Judith Miller and Broad begin the story in the book Germs with this incident, which you may remember or not remember. You may remember that in the 70s and 80s, there developed all these gurus, generally with some connection to Hinduism, although the leaders were often not Indian at all. They were American kids who simply put on the costume and became the leader. One of the most popular sects was led by a man called Rajneesh. And Rajneesh actually bought a whole town or an area near a small town in western Oregon or eastern Oregon, near a little town called Antelope. And he built this huge compound. The attraction of the sect was that although it was supposed to be sort of Hindu-ish, he said that being rich was wonderful and having sex was wonderful. So it was a kind of peculiar Hindu sect. And in fact, thousands and thousands of people who wanted both to have sex and maybe access to wealth came to Rajneesh, and he had all these people, and he told them to come and live with him in eastern Oregon, and they were going to create their own world. Well, they built basically on a wasteland. Western Oregon is very nice where the mountains are in Eugene and the university, but eastern Oregon, I mean, you ever seen eastern Oregon? It's like this plateau, and it's like a wasteland, it's like a semi-desert. On this semi-desert, they built this incredible compound with dozens of buildings where no grass grew. Grass was growing. All these people worked sometimes almost as slaves of the Rajneesh. They were caught up in the cult and in the sect. And then there were people in the small town nearby, some of whom were deeply religious, who said, we don't like what's going on here. So the small town was Antelope, and they protested. Rajneesh's response was to ship dozens and dozens of people into the town, who then turned out to be voters. And he took over the town. So now the little town of Antelope is part of Rajneesh's empire. And when the protesters still protest, this is what happens. So, where's my book? This is what happens. On September 17th, the Wasco-Sherman Public Health Department received a call from someone who complained of gastroenteritis after eating at another restaurant in the Dales, that's the area. In the next few days, the department received at least 20 more complaints involving 2 more restaurants. Less than 48 hours after the outbreak began, a pathologist at Mid-Columbia Medical Center had determined from a patient's stool that the bacteria making people sick was Salmonella, one of nature's hardiest germs, though infection usually is not fatal. On September 21st, within 4 days of the first report, scientists at the Oregon State Public Health Laboratory in Portland analyzed the stool samples further and identified the bacteria as Salmonella typhimurium, a common agent in food poisoning. In this case, they found they were looking at a very unusual strain that was treatable with most antibiotics. Since there were roughly 2,500 known strains of Salmonella, this was speedy scientific sleuthing. But by late September, reports of new cases were diminishing. Carla Chamberlain, a no-nonsense nurse who headed the county public health office, knew that between 1980 and 1983, the department had reported only 16 isolates of Salmonella, 8 of which were Salmonella typhimurium. None resembled this strain. And when the wave began to crest, Chamberlain thought the outbreak was over. In fact, the citizens of the Dales were under biological siege. Once the rod-shaped bacteria entered a victim's body, the invaders multiplied wildly over hours and days, damaging tissues and overwhelming rival bacteria. Their main weapons were toxins and sticky hairs on their cell walls that let them seize hold of the mucous membranes of the colon and small intestine and then force their way inside. The toxins caused the intestines to exude waves of watery fluid. Typically, abdominal pain began anywhere from 12 to 48 hours after infection, followed by diarrhea, chills, fever, and sometimes vomiting, lasting up to 4 days. Salmonellosis could be severe in the young, the elderly, and patients with weakened resistance. The diarrhea could be life-threatening if dehydration was not treated aggressively with fluids. On September 21st, the day after the Oregon State Lab identified the Salmonella strain that had caused the initial outbreak, Chamberlain's office began receiving a second wave of reports involving people who had fallen ill at 10 different restaurants in the Dales. All right. Somebody was poisoning somebody. And the attention was now directed toward Rajneesh, and they denied it. But then what happened was there was an internal civil war at the compound. And in fact, Rajneesh now came out on television and denounced his executive director and her assistant and accused them of poisoning the people in town. Now, he didn't say that he was part of the plot. He said it was her plot. Her counterclaim was, initially she didn't do it, but then, well, if I did it, He was behind it. Sounds a little bit like Enron and Andrew. No. It has some of that flavor. But in the end, they had gotten all of this by writing to a laboratory, and the microbes were shipped to them. As easy as that. And now they used it to what? To poison. So what I'm saying is, there are all kinds of private organizations, not governments, in the world, and that could include Al-Qaeda, that have access, either easy or difficult, to biological weapons. Some of them can be secured by simply writing to certain laboratories. Some of them can be secured by buying them on the black market because they were part of what we call the American or the Soviet arsenal. But there they are. Now, what are they? The what? I've already described to you the botulinum, botulinum, which is, of course, the thing, if it gets into you, paralyzes your diaphragm. There's also the terulanium, which results in terrible lesions on the body and incredible cramps and nausea and discomfort. But then there's a list here of things in store in America. There is bacillus anthrax, there's anthrax, there's tularemia, there's Venezuelan equine encephalitis virus, there's valley fever, there is tuberculosis, this is variola virus. They talk about smallpox being destroyed. One of the things that was cultivated as a weapon, as a biological weapon, was smallpox, and in fact it was strengthened, made even worse. There is paralytic shellfish poison. There's lethal snake venom. There's intestinal flu, and there's something called toxiferine, which is a paralyzer. And I don't want to give everything. The what is the capacity, and in fact, these things have been preserved because if you're trying to develop the antibiotics and the what, and the vaccines, you're going to have the what, the original stuff. So you can easily shift from one to the other. Now, it's the possibilities that are very interesting. What is now entering into the possibilities, and it was cultivated by the Russians, is this virus that appears in the Congo, which results in this internal, this bleeding, and the Ebola virus. And then the other comes from a novel that Bill Clinton loved. I don't know whether you read it. The Cobra Event. Does anybody read that novel? Let me just. It's called The Cobra Event, and Clinton loved it. But nothing caught the president's attention as much as The Cobra Event. The novel his friend Venter had recommended that Clinton read in early 1998. It depicted a mad scientist's determination to thin the world's population by infecting New York City with a designer pathogen. By combining smallpox, a virus similar to that of the common cold, and an insect virus that destroys nerves, the scientists invented an ideal doomsday germ, a brain pox, that spread quickly and melted the brain. The book opened with 17-year-old Kate Moran heading off to her private high school in Upper Manhattan. She had a bad cold. By art class, her teeth were chattering and her nose was gushing. Disoriented, she found herself seized by convulsions and bizarrely biting her own mouth. She collapsed, her body lashing back and forth, her face twitching uncontrollably. With classmates and a teacher standing by helplessly, she died a violent death, her spine cracking under the strain of her contracting muscles. The psychopath behind the killings also eventually fell victim to the bug he had created. It was a plot twist. honest. Clinton was impressed by the book's grim narrative and apparent authenticity. Preston's acknowledgment included more than 100 experts, the author, military officers, intelligence analysts, doctors, scientists, and officials in Clinton's own administration, including his advisor, in this case, Danzig. The novel science, Preston wrote in a preface, is real or based on what is possible. It's all part of what we call this genetic manipulation. So, how have we responded to this? Well, I do want to say that since 1995, the American government has been zealous about pursuing the idea of producing appropriate vaccines. The one plague, obviously, that they've worked with is anthrax. And there's an anthrax vaccine, and supplementing the anthrax vaccine is this antibiotic called Cipro, which was circulated. If you take the Cipro and you take the anthrax vaccine, well, that's helpful. So the American government is responding by trying to identify each of the possibilities and trying to figure out how you do the what? Do the vaccines. The anthrax vaccine was commissioned, and they've had trouble getting supplies. There's been some trouble. This firm called Bioport here in the Detroit area that has been producing it for what? The nation. But they seem to be getting things straight. What is being produced is an array of antibiotics and vaccines that will ultimately be able to meet the threat. Obviously, with every vaccine and every antibiotic that may work, you may invent what? Something new. So what are the realities that we have to confront? Well, the first reality is that there is a danger. I mean, it is a real danger, but you have to, by the way, mellow that danger. The reality is that up until now, the weapon of biological war has been very little used. In fact, the anthrax scare drifted off into what? Drifted off into nothing. Even Iraq did not fully use its biological warfare arsenal. One of the realities, of course, is the reality that pervades with regard to atomic bombs. If I use mine, then what? The opposition will use theirs, and therefore certainly the United States of America, if it ever chose to, has the power to retaliate in a way that would be absolutely overwhelming. So one is careful about the use of this weapon because there's always the counter-intimidation. Two, there is confusion as to what should be done. The United States of America banned the manufacture of biological weapons going all the way back to 1972 and 1975. And it did direct whatever facilities it had to now produce what we call defensive strategies, the vaccines and the antibiotics. But there's an ambivalence because there's a new project that emerged in the Clinton administration called Clear Vision, which is described in the book, which is an attempt to still experiment with certain biological weapons because, you never know what you'll need to use for intimidation purposes. And so it's a kind of a confused strategy. Are we part of the manufacture of it? Are we only into defensive strategies? And the third, and I think that's very important because otherwise the fear becomes uncontrollable. If there is the science to invent the bug, what's happened in most cases is there is the science to what? To provide some kind of protection. And in fact, science can be used both ways. And so one can focus only on the danger, but one can also focus on the fact that what people are busy providing the protection that one would need against. I mean, it's like most of us wouldn't be here today if we had not developed the protections against what? A dozen infectious diseases, right? Wouldn't be here. The reason why we're here is because those diseases were met by counter strategies. And one has to remember that when you think about this, otherwise one doesn't develop what I would consider to be a rational perspective on the danger. So what is required? Well, the first is, and it's very clear to me, the United States of America should not be involved in any way, shape, and form in the manufacture of biological weapons. And therefore, the Clear Vision Project I see, this confusion ought to be resolved. We committed ourselves to fighting it. We shouldn't be manufacturing alternative biological weapons. 2, we need to manufacture the resistance. Our great focus now should be to identify the what? The enemies, and to develop appropriate vaccines and antibiotics that can meet the threat. And there's no reason why the science that's available to us should not be able to do that. We also need to identify those countries that insist on manufacturing biological weapons and punishing them. Now, one of the great controversial issues that has come up out of the war is what to do with Iraq. And mobilizing the Allies presently to assault Iraq would be very, very difficult. However, if evidence could be produced that indeed the biological weaponry that might be in the hands of the Muslim terrorists in some way could derive from Iraq, then that would provide a justification for action. For me, the government of Iraq is one of the most dangerous governments in the world because they are prepared to use almost any weapon in their weaponry against the enemy. And therefore, our focus has to be very strongly on this country. Another rogue nation that needs to be watched because their behavior is so unreliable and because the people who run the country are essentially irrational. And that's the government of North Korea. Those are the 2 countries I place highest in terms of what I would call watching. And number 3, I would place Iran. One of the things we need to do is to stockpile what we need for the emergencies. I mean, one strategy is you go off to the doctor and you get 1,800 inoculations. That most likely is an inappropriate response to the level of assault that has taken place. That's what I would call false anxiety. And it's real anxiety, but based on what I would call false premises. What we need to do is to stockpile these things, and if they're needed, what? They're available for the people to use them, and that indeed should be reassuring. And the last, which I mentioned the first time I talked about the crisis, we need to lead our lives, ever since 9/11, with a certain level of courage. And courage means that we will not allow the terrorists to win their victory by demoralizing us. And in fact, they will have won their victory if we're afraid to go into a we're afraid to go into a restaurant, we're afraid to go on the airplane, we're afraid to do anything. Right now, most of the people ending up in airports arrive what? Safely at their destinations. Most people eating food in restaurants fine, and most people walking the streets are not being assaulted by deadly pathogens, and most people receiving mail don't need to wear white gloves. So courage means a level of rationality, putting the danger in perspective and in its place. What I often find sometimes is that people become very, very scared, are immobilized, and then they forget about that fear, and then they're immobilized by a what? By a second. They can never put their anxieties in perspective. We live in a world in which there are many dangers. One of the dangers, I don't think it's an overwhelming danger right now. One of the dangers is biological weaponry. What we need to do is to make sure that our government becomes a role model for the rest of the world in producing defense and eliminating the provocation and working together with others to do it. One of the best things to come out of 9/11 was the alliance with the United States and Russia. What has been established since then is cooperation in the world of biological weapons and biological war. Before, we weren't sure what the Russians are doing. Now, through the level of cooperation, we have a better understanding of what's going on in the former Soviet Union, and in fact, we're working together, and that cooperation is ultimately essential for the control of that biological weaponry. So, I want to just conclude by saying, right after this, I intend to go to the restaurant and have a wonderful meal. I intend to enjoy breathing. Do you understand? Breathing the air. I intend to go flying on airplanes and enjoying my life. I will not be intimidated and defeated by this enemy, which in many respects is much smaller than many of us have raised up. And so, enjoy your lunch and enjoy your week. And thank you very, very much. Yes.
Get into the delivery system.